For today's 10-minute book talk, I want to do a book that's a real challenge for me. This is really outside of what I would normally read, but I'm interested in it for a few reasons. I'm thinking of Shūsaku Endō's book Silence. This is a library copy, so it's lost the cover, but it does have beautiful kanji symbols on the front that would match the original publication. This, of course, has become a classic. It's a book that's read throughout the world, translated in dozens of languages, known as one of the great struggles of the 20th century in Japanese literature, a struggle of personal identity, a struggle of faith, and a historical fiction that's really quite poignant and quite controversial. Now, I was really interested in this book for three reasons. One is, of course, Martin Scorsese has a film that just came out in 2016 called Silence, and it's an adaptation of this book, and it's both a Scorsese-style approach and a fairly faithful interpretation in some ways. I'm not going to talk about the film, but I was interested in the book because of the film. I was also interested because I've lived in Japan, and I lived as a Christian in Japan, which is an odd, unusual, and problematic thing. I was a foreigner, like the main character of this book, and so it has a kind of a special interest for me, even though this was a Japanese person writing this book, not a foreigner. And then the third is the theme that's at the center of this book. Eugene Peterson says in Christ Plays in 10,000 Places that any understanding of God, he's thinking about novels and fiction and the way we tell stories, any understanding of God that doesn't take into account God's silence is a half-truth, in effect a cruel distortion. And I'm interested for these three reasons in this particular book. So this is a book about Sebastião Rodrigues, a Jesuit missionary who, and of course you can watch the Silence film trailer to get a sense of this too, and it'll give you a lot of images really quickly, but also reveals a little bit more of the story than I'm going to reveal. Fr Rodrigues is a Jesuit missionary who goes to 17th century Japan to be a priest for the oppressed church there, but also to find one of his mentors, a Father Ferreira, who's gone missing and is reputed to have apostatized, to have left the faith, to have pressed his foot upon an image of Christ and apostatized, and is reputed to be working for Japanese officials at this point. So Father Rodrigues, he wants to find him. That's really a big part of his search. And he finds out when he gets there, even though he knew there were dangers, he finds out that he's one of the Kakure Kirishitan, the hidden Christians, the hidden church that were persecuted in the 1630s and the 1640s in Japan. Really the period, at the end of 70 or 80 years of Christian mission and international connection with Japan from countries like the Netherlands and Portugal, and of course ports in Asia, there's a closing of this, and Japan moves into, of course, what is known as the silent period, hence the name of Endō's book. The story of Father Rodrigues is told actually through a number of kind of really interesting epistolary perspectives, so like historical notes, shipping records, diaries, logs, and letters that Father Rodrigues is writing, but he's never sure that they're going to make it out. He's not sure that his superiors will ever see what he's writing down, but he still continues to faithfully write it. I'm also teaching a Japanese religion and culture class this semester, and so I've been trying to exactly how to use Endō's as a definitive point in Japanese history. It's definitive because of the persecution of Christians. It really is one of the great effective persecutions in religious history, where a series of leaders have been able to press out of a population Christian culture. Largely, there were 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 Japanese in the 1630s, and again that many maybe in 1950, 300 years later. So it's quite a feat. The church was largely flushed out, and Japan began this retreat away from the Silk Road, away from the working and trading world, because of its own social, cultural, national, and religious identity. Christianity that it wanted to protect. And that period was relatively closed until America and parts of Asia began reconnecting in the 1850s, and Japan in the 1860s, in the Meiji Restoration, reconfigures itself as a world power in that point. And so this silent period of, a couple of hundred years, 250 years, is really definitive for Japanese culture. And so this is an important book for that reason as a historical fiction. However, I don't really think silence is about history. I mean, it's a historical fiction, but I don't think it's even about history of Roman Catholicism in Japan. I think it's a story about what it means to be faithful. Fr Rodrigues is drawn into this world. He works with the hidden Christians. He faces persecution, and then he also has the opportunity to apostatize in the face of great suffering. And all throughout, he has to deal with the silence within himself, his silence before God, whether to be silent before the people, whether to have courage to preach and to administer the sacraments, whether to be silent in front of the officials or to speak his apostasy out. And why is God silent in response to the suffering of hundreds and thousands of Christians in that country? Why is God silent? Why doesn't God answer? And is he the answer? Is Fr Rodrigues in some way God's answer to the problem? What makes this an even more thoughtful book is actually the character of Kichijiro. So Fr Rodrigues is thoughtful, questioning. He's not a wayward man, and yet he really does have a real temptation to apostasy. It's not fake. It's not just about pain. It's way more complex. Whereas Kichijiro, he's ingratiating. He's intemperate. He's a Japanese convert. We discover later in the novel who apostatized numerous times. He's a traitor in many ways, and yet there's this kind of depth to Kichijiro's character, that he plays this unrelenting role in Fr Rodrigues' own life, his own fate, and his own struggles with faith. The link between the two men becomes more intimate and complex as the novel grows. It's really quite a fascinating read from this point. So ultimately, the book is asking the question, really brought up in a quotation near the end of the novel: the country of Japan is not suited to the teaching of Christianity. Christianity simply cannot put down roots here. Now, this is historically untrue in a certain kind of way. There's more than 1 million Christians in Japan today, and they're actually, Christians are greatest where the novel is set in Western Japan, in Nagasaki. That's the greatest population of Christians today. But, when you compare it with China with 5 to 10% Christian, Korea with maybe up to 1/3% Christian, to have 1 or 2% of the people be Christian is not really that dramatically different. And I wondered myself when we got there, to what degree was it possible to really set down Christian roots in Japan, and living there as a foreigner, how those things would never be separate. Foreigner and Christian were always implicated in my presence in Japan. And for Japanese converts that I worked with in Japan and that I met and were my friends in Japan, they would often speak they had a real sense that for them to become Christian was to betray their Japaneseness. There's something essentially problematic about being a Christian in Japan for many of those. So that, it's super intriguing that Shūsaku Endō makes a gaijin, a foreigner, the protagonist of this book. Betrayal's the theme, the question of the heart of Christ, the silence, all of those things are at work, and the twist in perspective in silence, the foreigner looking in, is really an effective way for Endō to work out his own Catholic faith as a Japanese person. So I think this is a profound story written by a uniquely situated author, but I struggled to read it as a story. It's certainly engaging and interesting and well written, but I had trouble really connecting to the characters for a long time and to the epistolary structure. That was really difficult. And I also don't know how it sits in the Japanese realistic tradition. I understand, Haruki Murakami and his fantastic books a lot better. But how does it fit with Yusunari, Kawabata, and Snow Country, that kind of minimalistic tradition where nature courtails and contrasts of movement and stillness. These are the things that capture the novel. In some ways that works really well in the novel. In other ways, I don't know. Certainly the idea of juxtaposition, the contrast, that's a big part of this book. So though I personally struggle with the book, I have decided to assign this book to my students. I have decided to kind of make it part of my semester so that I had to come back to this book and really spend more time with it. It's super effective. It works really well as a spiritual book and provocative for question asking. I don't know what it tells of the history of Japan, but it certainly speaks to the character of being a Japanese Christian and the contrast that exists there, as well as our own question that Eugene Peterson wants to bring up. How do we deal with the silence of God? So that's the end of my 10-minute book talk. I hope you check out this book. Also, if you want to like and share this video, I would really be appreciative of it. You can find me on Twitter at Brenton Dana, or you can find me at my blog at www.apilgriminarnia.com. Thanks so much.